Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. Hello to everyone who is also watching us online. Our afternoon program of the conference is going to be live streamed, so please stay with us. Counter-narratives using the past to shape a hybrid future is the title of our second panel. Speakers will discuss about the potential of the archive which can be used for creating counter-narratives. How can history can be retold to suggest other futures? In this panel, we take a starting point in recent events and decolonizing movements that have created ripples in academic institutions, gallery worlds, and have made a marginalized topic into a public mainstream debate. We will work at the works by future artists who are all in some way using past and present history to change the dominant narrative. This panel will be moderated by Nina Mangalanayagam, artist and a senior lecturer in photography at HDK-Valand Academy, Gothenburg. Nina's research and visual practice explore themes of belonging, multiple heritages and hybridity, often using a semi-autobiographical approach. She has a PhD by practice from Westminster University titled Living with Contradictions, Rereading the Representation of Hybridity in Visual Arts, and a Master in Photography from the Royal College of Art. Her thesis was practice-based PhD in photography, researching how the shifting positions of being between black and white categories can be explored in visual arts. Nina, welcome.
Thank you very much, Marina, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for having this panel, which I'm really excited about. It's a subject that's very close to my heart. I will start by introducing the panel that we have here today, and I'll start with Hyun Huang. She is a photography and a multimedia artist from Vietnam who's living in Hamburg, Germany. She is finishing the master's program in photography at HAW, Hamburg University of Applied Sciences. Her work is a combination of photography, performance, and installation. She experiments with symbolic imagery, consumer objects, sound, and display technology in order to create immersive spaces that challenges the usual ways of seeing and perceiving. In her most recent work, Asia Bistro Made in Rice, she is focused on addressing stereotypes about Asians in the West and self-representations in the diasporic identities. Opposite Hien, we have Mark Duffy, who's an Irish artist based in the UK. Duffy's artworks explores issues of politics, power, and media in the public sphere. His recent ongoing documents, the aftermath of the UK's fractious Brexit referendum, framing these themes with absurdity and humour. Duffy also formerly worked as a photographer for the Houses of Parliament from 2015 to 2019, during which his photojournalism characterized many memorable front pages. Our third artist here today from the Futures program is Silvia Rossi. She lives and works between London and Modena, Italy. She graduated from London College of Communication in London in 2016 with a BA honours in photography. Her work retraces her personal family history, drawing on her Togolese background and the idea of origins. The theme of family is explored through self-portraits, in which she plays her mother and father, narrating their experience of migration from Togo to Italy. Her images are partially informed by West African studio portrait tradition. We also have invited guest Rolando Vazquez, who is a teacher and decolonial thinker. He is regularly invited to deliver keynotes on decoloniality, academic and cultural institutions. Vazquez is currently Associate Professor of Sociology and Cluster Chair at the University College Utrecht. Since 2010, he co-directs a summer school together with Walter Mignolo, which is hosted at the Van Abbe Museum. In 2016, under the direction of Gloria Wecker, he co-authored the report Let's Do Diversity of the University of Amsterdam Diversity Commission. Vazquez's work places the question of the possibility of an ethical life at the core of decolonial thought and advocates for the decolonial transformation of cultural and educational institutions. His most recent publications is Vistas of Modernity, Decolonial Aesthesis, and the End of the Contemporary, which I think had a launch last week in Amsterdam. Richard Kofi, who's next to him, is a multidisciplinary artist, curator, podcaster, and author. His drawings, videos, and curatorial work have realistic elements with speculative and futuristic interventions, and he imagines the otherwise potential of diasporic realities and circumstances. Currently, he is exploring the Afrofuturistic concept of astro-blackness, thinking of blackness as a way to relate to science, spirituality, cosmology, and technology. Kofi is also a city illustrator of Amsterdam, as well as this year's winner of the Tami Minele Foundation Award for his artistic practice. And in 2019, he was nominated for the Museum Talent Award and the And Award for the work he did for the National Museum of World Cultures, which we'll also talk about a bit later. Together with Miriam Weston, he curated the exhibition for the 150th anniversary of the Royal Prize for Contemporary Painting in the Palace of Dam Square. And finally, but not least, is Giulia Gelasova, who is also a Futures partner. She is a cultural producer and a curator based in Dublin, specializing in contemporary lens-based practices. She's general and project manager for PhotoIreland, co-running the library project, producing events throughout the year like the annual PhotoIreland Festival and Critical Academy, while collaborating on ambitious projects like this, the Futures Network, which is through the Creative Europe photography platforms. And also Parallel is another example of this. As of 2020, Giulia is also the co-editor of the OVA Journal, the critical journal of photography and visual culture for the 21st century. So thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to have you in this panel. So just a little bit of an introduction is that we'll take a starting point in this panel in the artists' work, the three Futures artists, who will all present a little bit of their practice. And I'm interested in thinking about how past and present histories are used to challenge a dominant narrative. Here, the photographic archive is not so much visible as used as a contextual framework. Silvia Rossi restages photographs of her parents, which never existed. Mark Duffy creates an archive as we speak of the very near past, the Brexit process. And Hyun Huang makes a visual relationship between historical stereotypes and consumption of Asian foods that point to prejudice in the present, while the specificities and the complexities of other cultures, or cultures elsewhere or also within, are erased. So we will discuss these works in context of the time that we're in, together with Rolando then, who focuses on questions of decolonization, with Richard, who is working within multiple forms of the arts to put focus on Dutch colonialism, and Giulia speaking from within a photo organization in Europe with its own colonized history that's being reminded in the wake of Brexit. And we will discuss the possibilities of photography to interrupt and challenge a simple linear narrative by suggesting other hybrid stories and adding multiple layers to this. Photography forces us to look again, to reread history and the narrative that has been given to us. And despite photography's very lurky history in eugenics and categorization, I still believe that photography has the potential to disrupt, the potential to challenge, and to create new storytelling. So storytelling, fictions, collections, performances create ruptures in the dominant flows of information. And I'm interested in this, so let's begin. So we'll start with the three presentations from the artists, and Silvia will be first to show your presentation, and then we'll have some follow-up questions.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
So hi everyone. Can everyone hear me okay, hopefully? So my work starts from personal archives. I use images from my own family album, in particular images that come from my family in Togo, which are quite peculiar in the way they resemble images by photographers such as Malik Sidibé, Saidu Keita, so very traditional studio portraits, very formal. So finding those images in my family album sort of inspired me to learn more about this kind of portraiture, in which I could really see the pictures of my family, my mother, my father. So throughout my images, I narrate my parents' story of migration using this aesthetic of West African studio portraiture, as well as text and video, which I incorporate in the work. In my images, the subject, which is myself, I do take self-portraits. It's always, staring at the camera, living in this studio setting, but also you can see throughout the work head carrying, which is sort of like the thread that leads all of the project. So my mother and grandmother used to work as market traders in West Africa, and this is the job they used to do before my mother migrated to Europe. So I use this technique, which it's very, ancient, but still survives in modern times, to sort of narrate this story. This is an example of one of my images, as well as those two. Those images in particular, they narrate my parents' experience in Europe. My dad first arrived in Italy, where I was born and where I grew up. He arrived at the end of the 80s. You can see from the images is surrounded by tomatoes, which are meant to symbolize the labor and exploitation of migrant bodies in the Italian context, as well as books that he's holding on his head, and they represent his education as a young student moving to Europe to pursue a career. You can see an image of my mother as well next to my father's. This image represents a moment that never actually happened and is not present in my family album. But it's the moment when my mom, living in Italy, she overheard a piece of news that was the passing of this law that would legalize migrants on Italian soil. So it's this very significant moment of transition from non-stability, a sense of not being stable in the country. You migrated to stability in a sense. And so my images, they do reference this traditional portraiture, but as well, they want to move away from that. So as the family album represents, you depict the best moments in life, and moments that you want to remember. I try to do the opposite. I try to show a more honest depiction of my family, if possible, and try to show their stories as in the best way as I can. And yeah, this is an installation that I worked on, and it's about head carrying as well, reflecting on this practice and how it's used in the everyday. And this is like a scene that I saw while walking in Togo, in the capital, in Lomé. This woman carrying a bag and getting tired of holding it, so placing it on her head. And it's such a simple scene. I try to represent it using photography, and by looking at the two images, you sort of understand the scene and what is happening. But then as soon as the video plays, then the images, the photography becomes an anticipation of what's going to happen in the video as it plays continuously. So yeah, in my work you see this sort of like analysis of head carrying that is very formal and performative, mixed with a more personal understanding of this practice throughout family histories, really. This again is another scene that I saw of this woman carrying this bucket full of clothes, and all of a sudden her phone started ringing, so she just placed the load on her head and she just took the phone call just like that. So I just thought of replicating the scene using my own body, and that is my work.
Cool.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions for you. So you had a show in Landskrona, which I was fortunate to see in an art space, which was beautiful. And in the text it said, what did it say? It's a story of heritage and culture that's both deeply personal and simultaneously universal, which I thought explained your work quite well. And I love how you, with very kind of precise and simple ways, speak both about the personal, but also, and you do that also from speaking from your parents' perspective, with two different people with two different experiences, gendered experience, circumstances, etc. I know you speak more about the kind of what happened in your parents' relationship due to their arrival in Europe. Which is very interesting, and how you take on both their roles in your photography. And so in a way, what I'm thinking about your work is that you're creating a family album that's missing, or a family album that was never made. And in that way, even though it's based on stories that are in your family, it's also a kind of fictitious album, because it's not real archive images. And there are other archives that are working with archive photography, such as Autograph in the UK, who collect missing images from people's family albums, or other equivalents in the Netherlands, for example. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about what you think that these fictitious albums can do, or what they add to the narrative, both maybe in your own context, but also in the kind of larger photography context.
So yeah, thanks for the question. Sorry, I'm like giving you my back. So I guess my intentions with the work were to come to an understanding of my family history throughout the archives. So I didn't have a broader intention, like a wider idea of what my work was going to produce. I guess I was very interested in what making work related to the past would turn my art practice in a way into what I could learn from digging into the past. So in a way, how could I understand my position as a Black person living in Italy and living around Europe? But in a wider sense, I started thinking about that after the work was produced, and actually looking at images from the family archive that, let's say, don't belong to a West African context, but images like my parents when they migrated to Italy, so produced on Italian soil, where you can see Black subjects positioned in an Italian landscape. Those images are quite relevant to me for a community of, let's say, Afro-Italian, even though I don't like that term, but a community of Black people living in Italy. So those images become very personal when you analyze them as singles, but then when you do collect them and you do put them together with others of families like mine, which share the same experience, then they do become something else, and they do, they constitute a counter image to what is the usual narrative of black bodies that, like mainstream. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So we'll probably come back with questions, but we'll go on to the next presentation, which will be from Mark Duffy. So if you want to take the lead, Mark.
Perfect, yeah. Thank you very much. I'm Mark Duffy. Thanks to Futures and Nina and Marina for inviting me into PhotoIreland as well, for nominating me for the programme. Work I'm talking about today is a sort of multi-strand project I made around Brexit, that wonderful topic of Brexit. I was working as the official photographer, for the House of Commons throughout a lot of the Brexit debate, which, was obviously an interesting place. It was a frontline view of sort of a catastrophe as far as I could see it. I was contractually obliged to be politically neutral throughout. Important to say, I didn't work for government. I worked for the public service institution of the House of Commons. So I was in there photographing this sort of thing. It didn't really happen before I started working there. The job was primarily sort of an internal kind of photography position, kind of photographing events for no particular reason other than to have a photographer there, essentially. Front line. Obviously, I was quite devastated by the result. I genuinely didn't think it could happen. It just seemed like such a moronic endeavour. But was pretty devastated and became pretty quickly obsessed with the topic immediately. I started to see Brexit kind of everywhere in my everyday life. Everything was like a metaphor to me. The first kind of body of work that I made sort of around it, not really intentionally, but just out one day in that bastion of British imperialism and colonialism, I suppose, the British Museum, and was walking through the installation where they have the Parthenon friezes, or as they're kind of more often referred to in Britain, the Elgin marbles. And I was immediately drawn to these. It's probably not apparent what we're looking at here, but we're looking at sort of the disfigured genital region of one of the statues. And to me, it just resonated quite quickly and quite kind of at a real guttural level for me. Brexit to me felt like this kind of act of self-mutilation. And I guess kind of working where I was, kind of in amongst the politicians that were facilitating this mess, there was like an extra feeling of sort of kind of powerlessness and emasculation for me. I had also anecdotally heard that a lot of sculptures in the Victorian era had been deliberately disfigured to suit kind of Victorian sensibilities at the time. Though this is, the British Museum have said there's no evidence for this, but there is evidence that they deliberately damaged specifically the Parthenon marbles with abrasive cleaning processes for just that aesthetic, to kind of really get that pure white marble. So it also as well kind of, obviously I said it was a very immediate thing and kind of this kind of very reactionary sort of work to me, but kind of it became more interesting then with researching what the Parthenon friezes were about and why they were created, and about how, there wasn't a Greek state at the time, just a series of city-states. And the Parthenon was a sort of propagandist power play to create this sense of nationhood. And all of the sculptures are essentially depicting the struggle of like the strapping, upright Greek people against sort of the demonic others, It was about creating a sense of nationhood by completely demonizing everyone else around you. And that just really kind of rang true with the rhetoric around the Brexit debate. And then I was as I say, I was quite obsessed, and maybe definitely to an unhealthy level, working in Parliament. So Brexit was my day job, and in Britain certainly it was all anybody talked about. It was all of the news coverage was around Brexit, and maybe 6 months in or something, I found it really kind of uncomfortable that, I guess this unique access, and I saw maybe a side of things that people didn't, and I became very skeptical of the sort of media portrayal of everything, the official narrative, when I saw like the way sort of the political journalism works in the UK is that it's essentially embedded journalism, and all of the sort of political journalists, you know, have to have a parliamentary pass, and they spend their entire days in there, and they drink in the same bars as the politicians, and so I was just kind of, I was sick of the official narrative, I suppose, and wanted to kind of really see what Brexit was and what the material kind of resulting artifacts of Brexit would be. So I started kind of collecting the physical evidence of Brexit, like anything that I could find that was a physical manifestation of this really devastating event. And it started out being a very kind of very literal, very true, and very specific to the actual Brexit referendum. It then expanded into an archive of artifacts that looked at just Britain's involvement with Europe in general, previous referenda, and also then kind of spiraled into kind of more personal artifacts, like we see here, empty packet of sertraline. You know, my kind of mental health deteriorated pretty, well, you know, significantly while I was working in Parliament. So the archive became also kind of a personal record. And it expanded beyond that again, and there were certain artifacts I wanted to get a hold of but couldn't, and so then I started kind of fabricating artifacts to illustrate stories and anecdotes, both personal and other. So, like I say, I was kind of obliged to be politically neutral when I worked there, and for the most part I was pretty comfortable in that I wasn't working for government, which obviously, you know, I wasn't a fan of. I was working for this institution whose publicly stated agenda was to encourage the public to be involved and to facilitate scrutiny, and, you know, I felt very much that I was on board with that, and that, you know, I was comfortable working in that role. Things kind of spiraled, and there was, as I mentioned before, this kind of press photography of the debates didn't really exist before I started working there. The institution wasn't really aware of it. I kind of, I suppose, sort of found a sort of roundabout way of making it happen. And the institution woke up to it with this one particular picture that went a bit viral, and things got very serious overnight. We went from having kind of no editorial oversight to having the most senior people in the institution having to say yes or no to a picture. And through this process, then kind of massive government bias emerged. Basically, the institution was very fearful of Downing Street, and yeah, massive Tory kind of bias. So I started, well, I was very much intent on preserving my position in Parliament while also kind of pursuing my artistic endeavours. And so I started to show the work, and unfortunately Parliament found out about it, and so things got very serious very quickly, and the termination process started. I was off work for quite a while with mental health issues, and I knew I was going to be fired. And I had photographed kind of every inch of the palace, the kind of grand kind of Victorian spaces. I'd photographed, you know, the politicians, obviously, every element. And while I was off, I was like, I know I'm going to be gone soon. I don't want to have regrets about what I didn't photograph in there. And so in my final kind of weeks before they fully fired me, I went in with a small macro lensed camera and this sort of forensic flash, and got in to photograph the kind of the material debris of politics, and also the deterioration to the palace itself. And it was kind of, I mean, it was a very obsessive thing. I was like kind of essentially on my lunch break sneaking around, you know, down on my hands and knees, photographing the wear and tear to the palace. The series is called On Pugin because the man who essentially designed the entire palace, this, you know, 1,200 room, quarter of a mile long building, and like absolutely dozens of the internal decorative flourishes like carpets and wallpapers and all that, was this guy, Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, an amazing name. But he was so obsessed with this endeavor that he eventually kind of drove himself mad and ended up in what was Bedlam Mental Asylum. So there was kind of parallels there with that for me as well. So yeah, so I kind of ended up with this body of work that yeah, I'm quite proud of now, but haven't really shown. This is the first time I've properly shown any of it publicly. So then I got fired from Parliament, and that was all very serious. But it was all quite good in a way too, because I had these kind of constraints of kind of political neutrality lifted. But my obsession was real, and it manifested in every aspect of my life. And kind of without really realizing it, I had created this sort of shrine to Brexit in my house. You know, I was like really obsessive about collecting these things, and it was at one point literally next to mine and my partner's bed. And so we really wanted to show the work, to get it out there, but because of the political nature of it, and because of how kind of institutions are set up in terms of not really having the facility to show reactionary work, it was my partner's idea, who's also a curator, conveniently enough, Bryony Carlin, who's probably watching. Hi, Bryony. She decided to kind of like, you know, use this opportunity to, I suppose, take some agency over the whole thing herself, and we turned our entire house into an exhibition space. We had some very, very nice flatmates at the time who allowed us to invite all of these people to come traipsing through our house, and literally every element of the house was open to. It was invite only, obviously, but every element of the house was open. So a different room dedicated to a different element of the work. I should say that I'm just showing a couple of elements of the work here because I only have 10 minutes, but I could talk for hours. So, you know, for instance, the sitting room was the Brexit archive. Other elements then spread out into the kitchen, you know, are very domestic spaces that we still lived our lives in around throughout the duration of the exhibition. That's Bryony there, enjoying a very comfortable bath in amongst these brutal, mutilated genitals of beautiful statues. Very comfortable experience. And literally our bedroom was also open to the public, and you could come and pull up, open our wardrobes, pull out our drawers. And this room in particular looked at the sort of impact on the mental health element of things. So had some really good reviews, really fantastic feedback, but probably the most interesting kind of review of all came a crack of dawn, early knock on the door, that I ran down from our third-story bedroom, and kind of, you know, when you wake up and you hear a knock and you think, did I actually just dream that, or was there a knock? And I was in my most threadbare underwear as I opened the door and see like about a dozen police standing outside of our front door. I haven't spoken too publicly about this, so apologies. It is actually still quite a fresh and raw thing. But yeah, basically the House of Commons had decided to raid our house on the basis of seeing these installation shots of this exhibition. And that was, yeah, that's the end of that story.
Thanks, and thanks for sharing that. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, of how, even if you put on an exhibition in your house, which is not in an institution, how the powers that be, how much they go through to actually protect a certain dominant story, and the difficulties maybe of having a counter-narrative, of trying to get that counter-narrative through. So thank you for that.
Cheers.
I have one follow-on question from that, except from my comment just now. So thinking about the objects that you're collecting, you're not only exhibiting the objects, you're also photographing them. So I'm interested to know, what does photography do to an archive of objects?
Well, like, I guess the main benefit of presenting them as photography rather than the physical objects is the sort of the ease of distribution, for one, you know, being able to present these not in glass cases that people have to come and see, that, you know, they can go anywhere, but also like democratizing the objects, you know, like the nail clippers isn't any less important than the giant Boris Johnson piñata. You know, they all have the same level of importance, and their physical stature shouldn't take away from that. So that's really important.
Great, thanks. And I know you're also planning a book, but we might come back to that.
Great.
Okay, so our last presentation will be from Hien. Stage is yours.
Hi. Hi, thanks Nina, thanks Marina and Future Melvek for this opportunity. And I'm Hien, and I'm gonna, oh wait, a little bit. So I'm happy to show you my current work, Asia Bistro Made in Rice. This is a long-term project of mine, which I work across photography, performance, and installation. And let us start with the video, please. Is there a sound? It should actually. Yeah, later. So. Yeah. In the meantime, I will. So I will talk. I will talk a little bit about the video we just watched. Is a trailer from the performance, which the title "Made in Rice." It's like, and it's featuring 3 performer artists, and they are interacting and performing with the food. In this case, it's rice, and it's one of the most Asian food when you think about Asia. So that, but it's also my favorite food, and it of course represents part of my heritage. So that's why I chose to work with that food, but also bring out another form of that food, like as a noodle or as the rice paper, and. Yeah, so yeah. The performance you can see later in the exhibition too. It's in another form, and you can hear the music too, and the sound too. So yeah, why? So what do I want to achieve with food, with performance? Actually, one of my most current interests, like to examine the concept of stereotype about Asian people in the West, especially in Germany. Well, I have been living there since 8 years already, and as I the first time I come there and I ordered some food. It was spring rolls, and it tastes a little bit different than Vietnam, where I come from. So and then I saw the menu, which has a lot of food from everywhere in Asia. It has something from Vietnam, from China, the noodle, or Thailand. So for me, I just realizing, oh, that's what people here think about Asia, and that's kind of starting point for me to start with this project. And yes, so as first, I'm gonna show you like the first picture, one of the first picture photography which I create at the beginning of this project, and from the beginning, I want to like try to visualize the stereotypes, the cliches with the pictures, with the food, and kind of like want to provoke it, and yes, and I also because my starting point was that kind of food store, that food consumption in Germany. So for me, it's more like the most natural thing to bring that commercial aesthetic into the photography, into the photograph. I got this. So this is. Who should I show this? Oh, right. So this is this picture. I took this picture later, and it's also very natural for me to come back to my relatives who are living in Berlin. They are from a previous immigrant generation for me, and to see how their daily life is actually surprised me a lot, because it's definitely different than what they told me or than what I imagined back when I was in Vietnam. And we were the Tet Festival, New Year Festival, and we had like a family dining, and they were cooking noodle, and because we're a big family, or many people come to the diner, so they put the rice noodle inside the tank, and because they don't have enough big enough pots, so they use that tank. And then looking back at that moment, I think is for me it's also it's a metaphor for me. It's the noodle in the tank is really for me a metaphor about how my relative lives in their community, and projecting to their friends how they work, live in Berlin, or how they like connecting to their community very very strong, but somehow they lack of some connecting to the outer community, which in German and so. And there's the mistake on that picture. It was my mistake. It was made in the photography. That photograph was took in 2019, not 20. Sorry for that, but it was took like 2019, and it was a coincidence that after that, like few months later, that the incident where the SS people traffic in UK, which happened, that the police they found like it's very tragedy, like 14 or 39 dead body inside, and a frozen transporter, and later most of them was identified as Vietnamese. So it's a coincidence, but knowing that, when I look back at my pictures, this also affect me a lot. That to see that the frozen the frozen body, that their lives were lost on that in that transporter, just because they want to have a better life, they think. But at the end, it ended up in a really a big tragedy. Yes, so part of my work is also about reflecting myself, because myself on that perception, on that stereotypes, and then I try to try to use the cutout of myself, and it has becoming something that I think that it's not me anymore, but it's more like a replica, more like just a material for the stereotypes, for the perception there. So yes, so and I also use a lot of pictures or things I found in my relatives, and also many stories about them, and to create pictures which tells stories is a fusion between a personal story but also a community story. Yes, so my work is very collage, because I use many elements. So that's kind of natural for me to come up with the photo book, in which I work with an art director, and we go deeper about how fraction, how collage my work can be, and how it can like change the way people can see my picture. And this is I have to find the camera, so so this is the dummy, and if you look at it, so we adapt many elements from the menu card from the restaurant, and And we also use many collage, many double pages to highlight more about that that kind of confusedness, and to highlight the complexity of that issue. So yeah, you're welcome to take a look at my dummy book later. I'm very happy to show you. Then I'm going to go back to the presentation. Yes, this is some excerpt for the photo book. And the photo book is, for me, it's not like a collection of the pictures. It's more like an extension, like a way for me to explore more about what kind of opportunity, what possibility I can create with this imaginary. And then I come to the performance, which you just saw the video earlier, yeah, so this performance is made in Rise is part of Asia Bistro, so it's also an extension, and there I worked with 3 performer artists, and each of them has interacting with a manifestation of rice, and then I want to use the food, the rice, not as something to nourish, to eat, but also it kind of represent or it is a metaphor for me for the limitation, and also a metaphor for the stereotypes about the Asian people. And this is, you are seeing the installation view from the performance work. We have like 3 channel videos which were projected on 3 big screens in the city park in Hamburg. They have, and that is a Japanese, it's a beautiful park, and they have the Japanese garden and tea house. Can I go back? Can I go back to the, doesn't matter. I think, can I go back? Oh yes, I can go back. Yes, so for me, I want to, because the performance were filmed in the studio, is because of Corona too. We were filmed that in January this year, and it was only in the film studio. And I want to bring the performance back to the actor and to the current context, which is, I think this Japanese tea house and garden can say and add a lot more to the context of how Asian cultures being represented in the West. And we have we have 12 sound channels, and I work closely with composer and also with many other artists and designer for the sound and also for the construction. And yeah, so I have another video. I hope that the sound can be played. Marina, could you please play the last video? So you can imagine that it is a very quiet sound played by a traditional music instrument in Vietnam called đàn bầu, and then you hear the sound of the rice in the back, and you hear the water. You hear how Kuoko, the artist, stomping on the noodle. You hear the sound of the birds in the summer night of the. So it's very. But yes, it's a big project, and I worked this time. I was lucky to work with many amazing and talented artists in other disciplines, and they also contribute a lot to the performance or to the whole project. Yes, and I'm finding myself now on on the way to exploring more about the screening and the display technology, how it can add up to my work. How can I use it to highlight my work, but also to interact with this. And that is then this time I had the chance to show the video, my work once again here at the Hybrids exhibition, and this time I want to highlight the transparency and also the limitation inside in our vision, in our way of seeing. And so that's why I came. We have now this the transparent display in the exhibition hall, which you can see later. Yeah, and I'm excited to see what's coming up next. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think you've covered a lot of my questions, but that's great. But I was kind of thinking about the experience of walking through this park and being between all these screens, and how, if you want to talk a little bit more about that, maybe about how do you imagine the viewer to view this work, or to kind of to feel, maybe, because you're talking about the music, which you describe very nicely to us, but which I think is great. So if you do have a chance to go into the gallery, please do. But yeah, how do you imagine the viewer?
I have been working a lot around this garden. So it is for that installation in Hamburg in the city park. We built 3 different big screens at 3 different places. It's around that lake, and I was concepted that people cannot really see all the 3 videos at once. Like when you see that video, you are missing the other. But at the same time, you know that all the 3 videos interacting with each other. So it's kind of like that. I want the audience or the visitor to have that confusedness, and to have that worriness that they're missing something, they can't see the whole thing. And it's also, I also concept that as just like as an happening. So people don't know what's happened. We just set up. Of course, it was a big construction, so people can guess it, but they didn't know what was coming up. And for the park visitor, that they can just. While they're enjoying the late night walk, they just saw that video, and they just found themselves surrounded with all the sound, on the music and the images. And I think for me it's kind of something very, very imaginary, very romantic too. But at the same time, the image is not romantic. So I think it's a very nice contrast for my work in that romantic setting, but with quite social relevant kind of image. I would say that. Yeah.
Thanks. That's brilliant.
Thank you.
So moving on to the discussion, Rolando, I'm going to start with you. So you have for many years focused on this idea of decolonizing and especially thinking about modernity in the Western world. And you teach in university, but you also run a summer school together with Walter Mignolo and Gloria Becker. And so just to put this in context, it'd be great first if you could explain a little bit about what you think is, or how you're defining decolonization, so it doesn't just become a kind of word that we take from nowhere. And especially if you could focus on the kind of creative practices and the artistic practices and then we can move on to the artist's work.
Thank you, Nina. Can you hear me? Is it on? Yes. Well, maybe first to clarify that we speak of decoloniality and not decolonization, because decolonization speaks of or refers to the political processes of the liberation of colonized nations, and which happened at different times, but middle 20th century, and also much earlier on in the Americas. Decoloniality is a process of overcoming coloniality. So coloniality continues after colonization. And so decolonization might have happened in most places, but decoloniality hasn't happened, or it's happening, or needs to happen. So I think that is an important element here. And I would say that the main focus is that we understand that there is no modern project of civilization, there is no Western model of civilization, there is no modernity without coloniality. That is one of the main statements of this current of thought. And which means that in relation to the arts, the way aesthetics has functioned in the arts, but also beyond the arts, has been to establish an order of representation that is a modern order, that is built on coloniality, that has been built on the silencing, on the erasure, on the oblivion of other worlds. This construction of a single order of representation has been built on the erasure of other worlds. So decoloniality, the task of decoloniality, is to work against erasure, to work against oblivion, to work against silencing, to unsilence, right? And it is an unsilencing that is not searching to become modern. It is not about reaching modernity by unsilencing. It is about overcoming it. That is also very particular of decoloniality. It's an unsilencing that brings a delinking. It's not a struggle to be included in the model that excluded other worlds, but is to go beyond that model into a model where we can speak of pluriversality and not of modernity.
Thank you very much. And so in that context, it would be really great to hear maybe some of your reflections on what you just heard and seen, thinking about how does one add plurality of voices into going beyond, like how?
Well, I think in the work of Silvia it's very clear that she's breaking the logic of the canon, where all those lives that we will call with our late friend Alana Lockhart Afropean lives are not part of the canons of history in Europe. They are not part of the national narratives. They are not part of how we understand even the everyday life in the social sciences. So she is really bringing photography to the task of unsilencing, of bringing another everyday experience of Europe to the fore. And this is the work of decolonizing Europe. It is the work of showing that Europe is a plural place that the national narratives don't correspond to.
And then also I'm wondering about the difficulties to decolonize. I mean, so both of us, for example, work in institutions, and there are complications within those institutions. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe your own difficulties in that process, but also maybe making emerging artists aware of the difficulties that they might come across, or that they might have to overcome to kind of function within this?
Well, there are many challenges, but I don't want to talk forever, but it's a very long topic. But, well, there are a few things maybe to mention now. One is not to confuse the task or the work of decoloniality with the institution. So I think there is a lot of confusion of we need an institutional transformation and otherwise nothing is happening. Yes, we are struggling for institutional transformations, but those are very long processes. But things are happening. Things are happening between us. So I think the horizon of decoloniality should not be just the institution or the state, but what we are doing among us. So relational processes and not institutional processes. So in other words, how we inhabit hegemonic institutions to make them speak things they were not designed to speak about, to make them host bodies, people, histories that they were not designed to host. And I think this is the work we are doing, which is at a long distance from changing the institution, but maybe it's more important also than just targeting changing new policies or changing who manages institutions. That's very important, but that is not the only struggle. I think we should not confuse that. Of course, the other part is how the institutions are incorporating decoloniality and how they are turning it into a marketing thing, a bit like Hein's work on rice, is taking the culture of others and making it into an advertisement, into we are diverse and all of that. And I think this is, of course, very dangerous. I speak of decoloniality being skinned. So they take the they take the conceptual tools of decoloniality, but they leave the organs to rotten, right? And the organs is the politics, the ethics, because decoloniality is not just about knowing certain concepts, it's about doing. So I think these are the two things I would like to mention now.
And on that, I'm glad that you mentioned it. And I've also, I guess I'm hesitant sometimes about the changes that are happening right now. So thinking about recent events that have happened in the last year, I know lots of things have happened in the Netherlands, but also worldwide. After the worldwide protests, Black Lives Matter, also decolonizing the university, there's been several movements. And so a lot of institutions are talking about it in a sense, and a lot of gallery shows, for example, are now focusing on issues that maybe weren't in the focus a few years ago. And I'm really excited, but also hesitant sometimes, and thinking, okay, is this just a buzzword? And then in 2 years, what's the lasting change? And so, yeah, my question to you is, do you think there's positive changes that are happening now that will actually remain, that will be sustainable?
Well, of course, it's difficult to be so hopeful, but I do see, particularly here in the Netherlands, we are living a special movement where some names that were glorified of people that committed colonial crimes have become untenable as school names, as art center names, as street names. Some monuments are becoming untenable. Some traditions are becoming untenable. So I do think there is a process of consciousness where the work we have been doing, many of us, of unsilencing, of telling a more complex history, more complex histories, we are reaching a stage of knowledge where this cannot be ignored anymore. Where, for example, the students know things, not because it is in the curriculum, but because through social media they learn things. They learn things that the university doesn't teach or that the museum doesn't show. And so I think we are facing a change in the consciousness that is making that position of what Gloria Becker calls white innocence untenable. You cannot anymore be innocent and suppose that these things didn't happen, that there is no racism. These type of things are untenable. And this is producing a change in which everybody in society has to recognize its own position, right? And I think that is a big change. Of course, this is also polarizing and it's creating a lot of difficulties, but it is a change that I don't see it will go away just by making decoloniality a buzzword, because it is transforming the way people understand themselves. So I think for us it is a matter of overcoming what we call the arrogant ignorance. So the arrogance of knowing that, or assuming you're at the center of the world when you are not, right? And of assuming a single history when there is no single history. So that type of ignorance that produces arrogance is becoming untenable thanks to the work of many, many people in many sectors of society.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to Giulia. So thinking of institutions and organizations, you work at PhotoIreland in Dublin, and for a broader, diverse European audience, maybe they're not always reminded about the Irish history. I think I speak from Sweden in that, and thinking in that not everyone always remembers the Irish history. So it'd be good for you maybe to talk a little bit about your organization in Ireland and the position of that in relation to European colonialism.
Right, yeah. Thank you so much, Nina. Yeah, it's true. I think there is a sort of maybe counterintuitive or a sort of an amnesia of the history of colonization in Ireland, from Ireland as well, of course. But there has been a recent, I think, a rediscovery of its own history. And I think predominantly because of what's happening in the last few years, all the international decolonization movements and conversations that have been happening, I think everybody is kind of reassessing their history. And of course, I think because Ireland is, it's a European country, it's kind of a counterintuitive thought that it was a colonized country at one stage. But it was. It was a victim of systematic starvation, exploitation, the destruction of Irish manufacturing, trading. But I think what's happened is that people maybe perhaps don't think that it has a legacy. But decolonization, it's not a one-off event. Colonization, rather, is not a one-off event. It's a process, it's a structure that remains in place. And I think the two states that have emerged in Ireland from its history are still being framed by us. And I think with Brexit, it's kind of framed new contexts and conversations around contemporary Ireland, around Irish identity. And I mean, as an organization, of course, these are conversations that we've always had. And I think we've always worked with, to us, Irish photography it's the whole island of Ireland. And I think what's interesting that's been happening as well in the recent process is the Irish photography kind of abandoning its connections to British traditions. It's finding new ways of working. I can flip to my notes just to make sure I don't forget anything. Yeah, it's basically finding new ways of working, and what does that mean? So Irish photographers are now looking at not just their histories, they're looking at more universal topics. For instance, out of futures, just because where we are, we have like Audrey Gillespie, we have Megan Doherty, they're looking at topics that are more universal. Perhaps you could, sorry, maybe just, yeah. Let me
yeah, that's great.
I don't know if I answered your question.
And I also think that you were talking about the structures within your journal, Over, which I thought was really interesting in terms of considering choices and who has the authority to create knowledge. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think that's a really good example, actually. Thank you for bringing that up. With Over Journal, that's part of our aim is this intersectionality. And we, instead of just putting forward, when we talk about inclusion and diversity, instead of just showing photographers, we wanted to put into the core of how it works. So our peer review panel we very intentionally spoke to the whole world. So our peer review panel we're basically working from the core to present diversity rather than just saying, here is an artist from here. And for example, we have Anna Ehrenstein is a good example. She's kind of like a regular contributor, basically. And she's working on decolonizing lens-based practices. That's her topic. And for another artist that comes to mind is Heather Agipong, who we've given the platform to basically not just show her work because she's exhibited it before, but to actually shout her message. And the journal, it looks at power structures and intersectional conversations, and how we do it is through the contributors and through the peer review panel. For example, if we're kind of going back to contemporary Ireland and Irish identity, regardless of its history, Ireland is very, very problematic. It's quite a racist country. We just have to look at things like direct provision systems. We have to look at just statistics. March 2021 has been the highest racist assaults in the history of Ireland. There's Irish traveller discrimination as well. And these are all topics that we have to engage with. So it's kind of, we're kind of re-engaging with our own history, but also reassessing where it sits within Europe, within not just Europe, but internationally as well.
Thank you very much. So moving from Irish history to Dutch history, Richard, you worked in multiple ways of highlighting kind of Dutch colonial history. I'm fascinated by all the kind of multifaceted ways that you work in podcasts, in curating, in drawing, and performance. So it'd be great to hear how you are working, and particularly maybe also putting some focus on the two exhibitions that you worked on at the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam. It'd be great also maybe for the audience to explain what the Tropen Museum is in that context. And thinking about the challenges of working with a collection from a particular museum.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's so much has been said that I really want to react to or have questions about. So I'll try to start from the beginning. Let's put it that way. But yeah, thank you for the introduction. My name is Richard, and I used to work at the Tropen Museum. Changed 2 years ago, so I'm speaking in the past a little bit, and I worked on 2 exhibits that are still on view. One at the Africa Museum in Bergendal, which is called The Afterlives of Slavery, and one that's still in the Tropen Museum, which is called Healing Power. And basically from what I really enjoyed about your presentation just now was that you used the family archives and looked at what was erased from that or what was missing from that. And we were basically doing the same thing on these 2 topics, so on slavery at one end and our collections of objects that were used for spiritual practices, spiritual healing practices. So those are those two projects. And what we wanted to do was to bring in knowledge that wasn't represented in the archives and see how we could create new conversations and new ways of working, much as what you said about dealing with these objects and with all the different perspectives that are on there. But we did that by choosing a clear perspective and kind of move away from that neutrality or that illusion of neutrality that most of these institutions hold on to. So the Tropen Museum is part of the National Museum of World Cultures, which is a collaboration of the Africa Museum, the Museum of Ethnology in Leiden, and the Tropen Museum here, and the World Museum in Rotterdam, by the way. So it was a very interesting institution with multiple collections situated in multiple places, coming from multiple traditions of collecting ethnographic objects. And what we did with the Afterlives of Slavery was to have like a panel of people of scientists and activists to kind of guide us towards this through this process of making this exhibit. The day after the very first day that I met the other curators, we immediately had like a reflection session of our own prejudice and our own ways of thinking about the slavery past. So we just met, and then right after, the day after, we had to kind of confront this panel already, which was a lot of fun. And we used that same model for the Healing Power exhibit. So talking to spiritual practitioners, to ritual specialists, to make sure that their perspective on our collection is also included, and that their perspective might also influence the way we handle collection, for instance. So for one of the shamans that we worked with said, well, in order for you to show this and that object, a ritual must be performed in your storage spaces. So we set up the facilities to make sure that we could do that, and also registered that in a respectful way, not to use it as a marketing thing, but to use it as a kind of a learning point in that case. And those kinds of things were really interesting about these processes. So yeah, the exhibits are nice, but behind the scenes there was a lot more going on. Also debates about restitution, debates about the position of spiritual practices in, for instance, Africa or Asia right now, and how they relate to other systems of nation building and religion. So yeah, it was basically, we included all of these voices to embrace the complexity of the things that we were talking about. And but I was also very inspired by what you said about that using these archives, or creating these stories and using these archives to create new futures, basically what we're talking about today, and how you then need to kind of break free from that idea of well, your occupation in that sense. But I had the same position at this institution where you had to deal with like how to act professional or scientific, and also wanting to create room to create these new conversations and to create, add new voices, add new people into the conversation, and possibly to create like speculative or things that are pointing more towards the emotional, and have them included in our forming of our stories, of our identity as an institution, and possibly of our conversations with the audience. And so that's also one of the reasons why I'm not working there anymore. I've been there 8 years and was fantastic, but to be able to make that step towards more freedom, and I really had to decolonize myself in a sense as well, and break free from whatever was limiting my imagination and my thoughts of possibilities in working with these histories. So yeah, and with the mental health consequences that came along with that, so that really spoke to me as well. And yeah, what I'm trying to do now is seek other sources, basically, for stories about the bigger things in our histories. For instance, your work reminded me of a conversation I had with Mungayende Helen Crestel. Shout out to Mungayende, awesome author, theorist, and we were talking about archives and how our family albums are basically our archives of our community, and that there's a lot of information and identity building and like confidence that we gain out of like these informal institutions, so to say, and we were having a conversation on how to deal with that, how to make sure that we create moments or places of meeting around these types of archives, and how do you kind of break open our notion of how to properly engage with culture while also hanging on to these archives. So yeah, that was what was really inspiring about what you said. And yeah, so for instance, I've been doing projects at barbershops right now, and also shout out to Malik Mahmoud, who in Rotterdam is setting up this night shop that he uses as a research center of urban culture, basically, of hip-hop culture, I'm sorry, in Rotterdam, really making sure that the interest and the perspectives of the neighborhood are reflected in the night shop, and that people can actually buy stuff that is useful to them, but is also engaging in this conversation of who are we in this neighborhood. And yeah, I've just been really enjoying all of these initiatives, so yeah.
Super, thank you very much. You, when we spoke the other day as well, we were talking about the objects in the exhibitions that you were showing, and some which have a, you know, an ethical problem with showing them. But you were talking about how you reframed it. So rather than, do you want to talk a bit about the stamp, maybe?
It's a very broad question. I'll stick to two examples, I think. Reframing. You know, with Afterlives of Slavery, for instance, we had a photo of a warrior from Boni's community, which was a maroon fighter fighting against the colonial powers in Suriname. And we were casually writing down, oh, this is a fighter from Boni's army. It took the colonial army 7 years to take down the base that they've made in this and that place. And then in one of these reflection sessions with activists and academics, they said, okay, so if you really want to make a shift in how you deal with these types of archives, and if you really claim to be decolonial, or you claim to want to embrace a black perspective, you should rephrase this. So then it became the fort of Boni was successfully defended for 7 years against attacks from the colonial army, which is a shift in perspective. But all these little details created huge discussions within the institute, and really gave the institute all of the time these questions of, okay, we don't support slavery and colonialism as an institution, so then we have to rephrase these things, and like that was very interesting to have those little details kind of blow them up and create huge ethical debates about them in the institution. And I hope that things change for the future. I think that with the new director Wayne Modest, I'm very hopeful, because he set up this way of working in the past for Afterlives of Slavery and Healing Power. So yeah, I hope much is gonna change as well. But yeah, also like other objects, like we had these burn marks that were used to kind of mark people's body and whose possession you were. And yeah, we also looked at not only the person getting the mark, but also at the person putting the mark on the body. Like, what's going on in your head that someone gives you the responsibility to do that, and you're like, yeah, sure, right? And those are like questions that were really good to see the complexity of the system that's behind slavery or coloniality, and see how, yeah, it affects our relations. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have so many questions, and I want to just keep asking them. I'm also aware that you probably have questions for each other before we go into questions from the audience. So if you want to, if anyone has a question, please, in the panel, please let me know, because you only, I mean, many of you have just met today at this table, so there might be burning similarities or questions. No? Well, otherwise I'll continue. Okay, I'll continue. Let me go to my... so I'm thinking about, in both Hien's work and in Silvia's work, there's an act of performing something that... performing something. In Silvia's work, it might be re-performing a gesture that maybe has been lost. Maybe there's a disconnect with the heritage, and then it's kind of reintroduced, and the body maybe remembers somehow. And I think there's a quote by you, Rolando, saying, remembering, relegating our earth bodies, our animal bodies, our ancestral bodies, opens a path outside our amnesic condition as individuals, as consumers, as spectators. So I'd be quite interested to hear you talk about, first of all, the experience of doing the performance, like what happens when you perform something, and maybe also have your reflection on it, Rolando.
What was the question again?
Like what happens when you perform something? What happens when you kind of take on a performance and like act out a stereotype, for example, to break it? Like what happens within you? Or
Yes, so for Made in Rise, I did perform it 2 years earlier in an performance festival in Hamburg, and I was performed there by myself, and I was the person who putting the rice papers on, and yes, it's this for me that at that time I really feel like I'm the spring rose, I'm the summer rose getting wrapped up, and the rice papers for me. Or the spring rolls, so it's represent for me really. It connects very well with the body, and like having that rice paper covering myself is really reminding me how you can like cover yourself and make your body like invisible, and that is something I did experience, or I did know that what my relatives or what the people from first generation of immigrant in Vietnam, from Vietnam coming to Germany, how they try to live a quiet life and try not to say anything, don't try to have problem, and that also reminds me of what I read as Frantz Fanon about, like the immigrant body is an invisible body, and at that time, like putting that, I really like that. For me, the experience is impacting a lot. That helps me later for this year on directing the performance. And Suna is the artist who performed that role, take that role. And it was challenging for me too, because I know that when she was sitting there, she cannot breathe under that rice paper, but I really want to capture that, and yes, I guess that is for her. I think she does experience that moment as I am, but also for me there as director, and also for the whole camera crew, that it was a really intense moment for all of them in that film studio, seeing Suna cannot breathe. And yes, so I think it's also impact my film crew too, who then come up to me and say, wow, that's really come through with that short of breath. And yeah, that was my part.
Thanks. Do you want to say something, Silvia, about kind of reintroducing a gesture?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in my photographic work, I do perform as my parents, and that moment, I don't really consider it a performance, because I do spend a lot of time looking at images from my family album, so it's more like listening to stories that my parents tell me, and then looking at images where they're portrayed and analyzing their gestures and movements, and then making them sort of like a memory that is stored in my head. And when it comes to taking that image, I don't really feel like I'm performing. I don't know, it's quite hard to explain. But then in the work where my mother and my grandmother are performing as well, well, those I find more interesting, because it makes me reflect on gestures and muscle memories. There's a video that was on the first slide. It was really tiny, so you can probably see it, but it's a video of my mother and my grandmother wrapping this fabric ring, which is used by egg carriers to sort of like protect their heads from the load. And in the video, my grandma is, she's blind. So when I asked her to produce the ring, she just did it. And I guess I was interested in seeing how her muscle memory would act in creating something that she hasn't performed in years. And it was just interesting to see her perform that, because it wasn't really a performance, it was just her memory acting on her body in a sense. So, yeah.
Thanks. And Rolando, do you want to reflect on it?
Yes. Well, there are so many things to say, of course. But I will continue with what you are saying, Silvia. I think there is a problem with the concept of performance that makes it a bit different from remembering. So when we speak about remembering, we're speaking of membering back what has been dismembered, because coloniality works through separation. It produces us as individuals, as classified individuals, or as non-classified individuals, right? Like the norm. So often performativity that is connected to the notion of performance is a sort of privilege of identity. You know, it's something where you, not always, but it is often interpreted as a privilege of identity, where you perform, where you become part of a logic of representation, and where there is some people that have the privilege to perform something or to choose an identity, and some others that not. So who can perform what is one big question. And to what measure is that a privilege or certain forms of individuality, right? So I think for us it's very important to distinguish this sort of performance or performativity from positionality. When, for example, you, in both your works, when you are relating back to what we will call ancestral memories, it is a work of positioning, it is not a work of performing. It can be a positioning as performance, but I'm putting the emphasis in positioning. You cannot choose who your grandmother is or what is your relation to rice. That's something you came into to the world. And this is the work of remembering, right? And escaping the amnesic condition of making you dream that you can perform anything into a futurity that is uprooted. So part of decoloniality is to answer to that system of artificiality and individuality and look back at the relations, because we all come from the life of others. But we are made to forget that in our individuality, in our authorship, in the radical novelty of contemporaneity. So the movement of time is radically different when you are performing for a radically new thing and a futurity than when you are remembering to produce hope, for example, to go against the injustice of erasure.
Thank you very much. I also have a question, and that's for you, Richard, which would just be kind of a piece of advice for, because you've been working on all these different art forms with different collaborators. And so a piece of advice to emerging artists who are entering into this world, who are challenging, trying to disrupt, trying to kind of do something, but who also try to survive in Europe.
But also try to survive. I think that's a very interesting addition to it. Yeah, thank you. Oh, I find it hard because I still consider myself a little bit emerging, so I don't really have that much more experience, I think, than the most. But what helped me a great deal in kind of balancing everything and making sure that I organize myself properly, but that I'm also really engaged in all of these conversations and in having enough time also to sit by myself with my work and creating something and having it grow on me, is also not to take myself that serious and to see also my work as a tool to change something in myself, not only looking at this big this world around us, trying to change something in that, because I don't know, maybe it's my work, but I haven't felt that I had made that much significance. But I think that looking at how I relate to that world and how I relate to everything that's going on, and using that also as a way to change something within myself and how I look at things, and to really dive into what my position is in society, or in the things that I'm questioning, helped me a great deal. And also allowing myself to speculate, to fantasize, to go totally off track in things, and not take this world too seriously or myself too seriously in how I never think about my career, for instance, or what's my next step, this and that. No, I never do. I don't know if that benefits me or not, but but really maintaining that sense of improvisation as well, and not really taking things as they go also really helped me a lot, and gave me the freedom to be at different places at the same time. So as I was working for these institutions, making like these big decisions on exhibits that would where there was a lot of money involved, but at the same time I was doing like strange underground shows in concert halls in small towns, or in churches, in villages, or whatever. But yeah, I was just having fun with it, actually, and making sure that it reflected, that it was a question that was relevant to me. And I think that when you make something that's relevant to you and that speaks your truth, then it resonates with something universal immediately. And if you really want to go to the universal stuff right away, then it can get quite hard. But I think that you're all on the right track, so I'm not worried at all. But that's also what I liked about your work, that it wasn't only speaking on the Brexit and on these bigger things, but it was also about how you felt in that, and your emotional development within that. So that's what I really appreciate. So yeah, I already like your work. So I think you're on the right track.
Thank you. And with that, we open up for questions from the floor. I think there's a mic somewhere. Any questions?
For Giulia, I wonder if you could talk about what you think exactly changed in Irish photography, which allowed us to, look beyond our own history and start, exploring more universal, globally accessible topics.
Sure. I suppose what I meant when I said, when I was talking about connections to British traditions is, for example, this kind of straight documentary approach as one example. And what I meant by new ways of working is people engaging with conversations around, in Ireland, around diversity, around gender, these kind of more universal concerns. And I suppose what made me think about people like Audrey or Megan Doherty that I mentioned earlier, because I was also thinking while we were talking, I think there's a small problem. Sorry, this is kind of, I was thinking, so it's a little unformed, but there's a problem, for example, do we need to show, which kind of brings me back to this legacy of colonial influence. Do we need to show, for example, a UK photographer's work on Ireland when we have our own Irish works that are, again, universally relevant and more important and more urgent? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I was thinking for the last few minutes. But yeah, I think there's a really interesting shift happening and a really interesting progression happening. in Irish photography. And yeah, and Brexit and the pandemic and all this is reshaping and reframing a lot of what's happening between the two states. Yeah, so that's my thoughts.
I hope I will. I'm a bit afraid of asking the wrong question or in the wrong way, but I was wondering, in general, what do you think about photographers working in different countries and more than different countries in different cultures than their own? And this is not saying it's something good or bad, but just I would like to have your opinion on that. And that's a question.
I think like it's important to have outside views on other cultures, but I think the real problem is when we kind of obsess about one particular sector's view on another culture. I think, like Giulia was saying, there is like a bit of an obsession in Ireland with how other people view us, and like, you know, we see major institutions dedicating like very precious space to showing only kind of foreign views of Ireland. I think that's where the problems really rise.
And certainly, if I may add, in Ireland the photography scene is very small, so these things make a really big impact. Like one show, it makes a big difference, because also this is what people see. This is what people view Ireland being, or this is what people view Irish photography to be. So, just to add.
Yeah, I can add up a little bit. I find it's important actually that people from other countries doing work about another countries. But I also think it's something that where the artists and country workers have to be very careful. And I also think that it requires a lot of communication and exchange with artists or people from that original country. But I think is of course is encouraging, and but yeah, I think it's very sensitive topic. But for me, I mean, like there's also many artists with Caucasian background have worked about Vietnam. Or about Asia, and sometimes you see it's the same image keep being produced, and I think it's part of responsibility from curators, from organization, for institution to see that what image, what kind of story they already have, and like try to encourage. Stories from other perspective produced by artists from that original country, or it can be collaboration or produced by other artists too. But another narrative, another perspective is important. Yes, so we keep working.
If I may add something. I shot my work between London and Togo, and I mean, my family is entirely from Togo, but I grew up in Europe, and working there wasn't as easy as I expected. So my idea for this project initially was to take photos of market traders around Togo, just like carrying goods, and I thought I could just go there and interact with people and photograph them, but I wasn't really aware of how much the history of photography has an impact on people still living there, and how much people are aware of the power of the photographic medium. I wasn't aware of religion. Like many women thought I would just take that image and then do voodoo on the surface of the image to control their bodies. And also, I guess, we're often not aware of how photography reached many continents, like shortly after it was invented, so people have a wider understanding of what this medium is. And also by taking images of those women, obviously, I could have got permission, you know, people, I could just ask people, can I take your image? And people could have trusted me, but then I wasn't sure, I couldn't be sure they had a wider understanding of what a gallery was or what a photo festival was if that image was going to be shown. So I guess a bit out of fear, but also for other reason, I decided to turn the lens towards myself and explore the market throughout a more personal
Awesome.
view. So I guess it's also on us to negotiate whether we want to, where we're going to go, really.
That's a really good point. Also, since I can imagine that your photography also asks a lot of questions about yourself, right? Of senses of belonging and stuff, and that's also a pitfall that I think for many people in the diaspora, to we grow up with all of these questions and how to position ourselves and how to develop ourselves and where do we come from and all kinds of stuff like that. This is not related specifically to what you were saying, but it does relate to what does it mean as an outsider to go someplace and make photography. I think we also have to be aware of the fact that the way we ask questions and we want to define and manifest ourselves in the West is different or has consequences on the person who you are putting on the photo, basically. And that sometimes our way of explaining ourselves or of explaining what's going on there is very ethnographic in a sense, trying to explain every single detail instead of just capturing something that feels right or something. We also we carry there's a pitfall in when you do that also, coming from the diaspora, going to, for instance, Ghana for myself, and making these photos or engaging with the arts in a way that I come to take something. So I think that we have to be very careful, like you said, and have to come with clear intentions and knowledge of the place if we want to engage in that.
I wanted to extend on your question and maybe just speak a bit about what Silvia was saying about representation, privilege. I come from Mozambique, but I have the same kind of layering when I arrive to make an image because I understand my plurality. And I think my question is to get a sense of you, the artist, of course, own sense of plurality, multiculturalism, just understanding your polyphony, you know, when you're arriving in your, you know, I go to Mozambique often, but I still have distance. There's a distance that is established between my life then there and today in France, and even, you know, knowing that I'm Mozambican, I still create distance. So because I understand my personal privilege, my personal multiculturality, my personal plurality, my polyphony. So I wanted to, I think the entire panel can have a saying in this question to kind of, where do you get the window? Because I'm always trying to find the window to go over this idea of modernism. Where do you find your window, you know, to kind of go beyond this idea of, you have to be careful. You cannot make pictures. You can, where?
We have time for a very quick answer. So do you want to direct it to one speaker?
To Rolando, Dr. Rolando.
Thank you. Well, I think this connects very well with what we were speaking about of the question of positionality. I think in the work of Mark, we face a similar question for different reasons, but the impossibility of neutrality. Mm. You know, you were demanded to be neutral, and that was impossible. Mm. It was an ethical impossibility. But that neutrality, when it comes to photographing Asia or Africa or Latin America, is part of a position of privilege. You know, where who gives you the right to take the photo of the other? And who is seeing and who is being seen in this economy of the visual. So I think turning the camera around and going to the everyday, like in Silvia, or contesting the marketing images that are erasing your history or your personal relations, are part of the answers to this supposed neutrality that is hiding a privilege of the gaze, what in my work I call the white gaze, right? The gaze that created a regime of visibility, a regime of aesthetics, where if you don't go into that language, you are not seen, and you are not recognized as an author, but also you don't see the violence of who represents and who is represented.
I have to interrupt you, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for a super interesting discussion. And it's been amazing, and I'd like to continue the whole day. But we have to stop with time, and there's probably so many questions that you'd like to ask each other as well. But thank you all, and thank you, Futures.
Thank you.
Hien, thank you, Silvia, Richard, Rolando, Mark, and who is Giulia with us for being our guests. Thank you also, Nina, for moderating. We'll have a 15 minutes break, and then we are here again from 3 p.m. for our next panel. Bye.